In 2016, my family went out to Virginia City in Nevada to check out the camel and ostrich races. It was there that I got to ride a camel myself. Within a few years, I was beginning my study on the notorious bandit Black Bart. Link to that episode is in the description. While at a museum in Calaveras, California, I read a story that I wrote in my notebook that had to do with camels. I thought it was interesting, something to look into at some point. Well, apparently, there's a ton to unpack about camels in the West. About 100 years worth, taking us from just before the Civil War to the very first camel race of Virginia City. A book written by a guy named Abe Hook called Travels in Tartary, Tibet and China during the years 1844, 45, and 46 was published and found its way to America. In this book, the author describes the use of camels for traveling and the usefulness of these interesting animals. Soon, those in the United States government got a great idea. The year was now 1853, and Jefferson Davis, who at the time was the Secretary of War under President Pierce, advocated for Congress to buy a bunch of camels for an experiment to see how camels would do in the Southwest desert. Sure enough, after a few years, $30,000 was put aside for the, quote, purchase and importation of camels and dromedaries to be employed for military purposes, end quote. While this was going on, another guy named Gwynn was pushing the book to his buddy, Edward Beal, pushing the idea of camels relentlessly. Beal thought it was a stupid idea and kept pushing the book away. Beal will be an important figure in this story, but for now, let's go back to Jefferson Davis. He put it up to Major Wayne to go to Europe and Africa to study the camels. He loved them and bought a bunch and shipped them to Texas. Now, I have to mention an article I read by National Geographic. It claims there was an ulterior motive for bringing the camels to the United States. And that was an underground slave trade, since the slave trade was banned by the United States back in 1808. These smelly camels would hide the slaves that were being transported down in the bottom of the ships. I'm sure that's possible, seeing as the people that spearheaded this experiment would go on to be Confederates, Davis, of course, being the president of the Confederacy, but I think it was more of a added bonus to them, if anything. Now, in 1857, we get a new president, Buchanan. Davis was no longer the Secretary of War, and people were worried that the camel experiment would get canceled. The new Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, liked the idea, so he continued on with it. Major Wayne then took the camels up to Camp Verde in Texas. Beal, the guy I mentioned earlier, was a well-known guy. He was the one who brought the first gold nugget from California to Washington, D.C. And of course, he was known for his part during the Mexican-American War. Now he was a surveyor and was contracted by the government to make a road to Los Angeles from New Mexico. Beal gladly accepted it, but when he was reading the fine print, he saw something that really ticked him off. He was to take 25 camels along with him. Beal was mad. He hated the idea and wrote back and forth, arguing with Mr. Floyd, but eventually succumbed to his fate. He trekked out to Camp Verde, got the stupid camels, and started on his way to create the wagon road that he was hired to make. The people hired to go along with him were mostly Greek, who didn't have a clue on how to deal with camels, but luckily he had a few camel handlers too, so that was cool. In the beginning, the camels were slow and took hours longer to get to places than horses and mules. But as time went on, the camels adapted and started to actually outperform the horses in just about every way. They could carry 700 pounds easy, remain steady the whole day. They went through all kinds of terrain that the horses and mules didn't much care for and would eat whatever you gave them. And they could go days without needing any water, unlike the horses and mules. They were quiet, didn't fuss, didn't stampede. You didn't have to watch them like a hawk. They did well in extreme heat, and they were experts at finding water when needed. Beal eventually went on to write, quote, "I believe at this time I may speak for every man in our party when I say that there is not one of them who would not prefer the most indifferent of our camels to 4 of our best mules." Obviously, the camels won over Beal. Beal was afraid of crossing rivers with the camels because he was told that they couldn't swim. But sure enough, they crossed better than the horses. None of them drowned, while a few of the horses did. After about 4.5 months, they finished the road and made it to LA. By the way, both the Santa Fe Railroad and Route 66 follow this old wagon road. Now, with the job completed, Beal headed up north of Los Angeles to Fort Tejon or Tejon or Tahoon, however you say it. I don't know. I'm sure all you guys can tell me in the comments. He was told to bring the camels back to New Mexico from there, but he didn't want to. So he made up the excuse, telling the government that the camels would be invaluable to the Californian army if they needed to fight in the Mormon War. He then gave about half of his camels to his business partner and then went back home with the other half. His business partner took the camels that belonged to the government to his private ranch and used them to haul freight. Floyd then announced that the camel experiment was a total success and that the military should get 1,000 camels at once. Congress disagreed and told him no. He kept asking for more camels for a couple more years, but the Civil War pretty much killed all pet projects. In 1859, Beal was called on again to go back and improve the road because immigrants and travelers complained that it was confusing and not all that great, as Beal had said. He was given another 25 camels to do that. But let's stay in California, okay? Beal's business partner had run-ins with the Mojave Indians from time to time, and one day, a huge band of them was seen, and they looked like they were ready for war. Either the business partner or the camel handler, there's conflicting accounts of this particular story, mounted up on the camel, had the other laborers do the same, and they charged at the Mojave, who basically freaked out and ran away. Later on, the army set up an experiment to see how they would do with mail delivery. So Fort Tejon, whatever, became the terminus of the first ever Camel Express. It was an epic failure. Camels are slow and steady, not designed for running like horses. So 2 out of the 2 attempts resulted in the camel dropping dead from exhaustion. From there, the camels were used to try and map the Nevada-California border, but the people leading it kept getting lost, so that was a fail too. From then on, the camels were being tossed around like a game of hot potato. Nobody knew what to do with them, and eventually they just sat around for 3 years, wasting away and using up government resources. By 1863, we were in a civil war, of course, and we had a new president, Lincoln, and his war secretary decided to sell the camels off. By the way, fun fact, Confederates took over Camp Verde over in Texas, which still had a bunch of camels, and so they used the camels for their own Camel Express for hauling freight, and also used one during the siege of Vicksburg, but it was shot and killed in battle. Anyways, camel fever, if you could call it that, spread around California. Some businessmen bought a bunch of camels from China and sold them in San Francisco. All of those camels went to different places like the mines, the circus, the zoo. But the military camels were bought by a guy named Clanahan, who gave 3 of them to a friend who ran the circus over in Sacramento, and he used the rest to haul freight to Nevada. But before doing that, he held a charity dromedary race in 1864. In case you don't know, a dromedary is a 1-humped camel, while the 2-humped one is the real camel. So this race got a lot of attention, and basically the way I would describe it is like a Charlie Chaplin movie. The people loved it, and the money that was raised, of course, was given to charity. Soon, most of the camels made it to Nevada, where a bunch of them were used for silver mining in the Comstock lode. Some of you might know that mining back then required heating and smashing the ore, then mixing it up with mercury and salt. Well, this was the camels' job. Trek out to the salt marsh and bring back a ton of salt. Repeat. The poor camels were dying doing this job, and soon a cyanide process replaced the salt process. So the camels were disposed of, either by making them into food, like jerky, or, taking them out into the desert, throwing a tennis ball out as far as they could, yelling, "Fetch!" and abandoning them. This resulted in Nevadan wild camels, which roamed around and blocked roadways often enough that Nevada made it against the law for camels to be on the highway. Fast forward all the way to 1959. A guy named Robert Richards wrote a fake article about the Virginia City camel races. That was the Territorial Enterprise newspaper. Turned out, the San Francisco Chronicle reprinted that article and later realized that it was all a joke. So the editor of the Chronicle challenged the Enterprise to hold a camel race for real. They sent some camels, and the Hollywood director, John Huston, jockeyed the first race and won. From then on, Virginia City has hosted the International Camel and Ostrich races every September. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to sign up for my email list. I only send an email when there's a new episode for you. Also, if you don't know, I make this show in 3 different ways. Video podcast for platforms like YouTube, an audio podcast for platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and I also make an article version for those that prefer to read, which you can find on my website, rickyshistoricaltidbits.com.